Queen Elizabeth II was born by a caesarean section at 2:40 in the morning on April the 21st, 1926. At the time, Britain was a shattered nation. The girl, whose birth was celebrated by a modest group of supporters, would become the greatest monarch of the 20th century, with the longest reign of the English monarchy. Although she was third in line of the succession to the throne, her uncle and her brother were relatively young. If her mother had subsequently given birth to a male child, then, according to old British laws of succession, he would have been immediately ahead of Queen Elizabeth in the race. It did not seem likely that this golden-haired child would one day be queen. But the birth of the Duchess of York caught the attention of the populace and papers, perhaps because people at the time were looking for a good news story in those dark hours, and that lasted for days. One newspaper speculated about the possibility of the baby girl becoming the future Queen of England, but overall, the celebration was due to the birth of yet another member of the royal family who, by the standards of the time, was particularly small. In January 1927, when she was 9 months old, her parents left her and embarked on a 70,000-mile sea journey to Australia and New Zealand that lasted 6 months. Her mother was upset that she had to leave the child, but the empire demanded it. Elizabeth was to stay with her nanny and grandparents. Before she was aware of it, the demands of royal work and family were already pulling her in opposite directions. Today, we might think it cruel for parents to leave a 9-month-old baby and go on a trip, but at the time, that was normal. Still, Elizabeth was born into a warm and affectionate family. It is likely that she had a more loving and secure childhood than most of the children of Britain's great aristocratic dynasties in the interwar period. According to Elizabeth's nanny, the girl was very serious and orderly, but also docile, good-hearted, and lovely. She also said that the Queen had a happy and sheltered childhood, supported by her mother's cheerful spirit, her father's attention, and her sister's company. George VI, while Duke of York and King, was a physically active father. He loved equestrian lessons and playing with his daughters. He enjoyed card games, charades, mime, and small theatricals, as did his daughters. The King quickly began to educate Elizabeth for her constitutional role, making sure she read newspapers, understood public affairs, and had good political knowledge. The princesses lived almost removed from the everyday world. She had no friends outside the narrow circle of her relatives from other renowned families. There was an attempt to bring the girls into contact with the real world of London by taking trips on the underground and buses, outings to the museum, and excursions to public swimming pools. But except in cases where people were evacuated in advance, the spectators crowded quickly around the princesses, and the shouting made it impossible to continue the activity. Except for her marriage to Prince Philip, the Queen did nothing out of line with what was asked of her. She never said a shocking thing in public. There are no reliable recordings of incidents where she lost her temper, cussed, or refused to fulfill her role. The defining event in young Elizabeth's life occurred in 1936, when her father became king, making her his successor. Upon hearing the news that she would be heir, she replied, "What, do you mean forever?" The move to Buckingham Palace was an even bigger shock. The mother of the future queen described it as the worst move of her life. But the new royal family managed to make Buckingham Palace a much more comfortable place. After her father's coronation on May 12, 1937, Elizabeth wrote her account of the momentous event, saying that the ceremony was boring. But from that moment on, the princess was treated with even more affection and interest by the press. Almost always with her grandmother Mary, she quickly learned the solemn and discreet behavior that the public expected of royalty. Solemnities aside, what other things did she learn? She was never given contact with the curriculum and formal structure of a classroom, which is why many consider the Queen to have a poor education. Still, Elizabeth had a good French governess and learned to speak the language fluently at an early age. Her school curriculum was quite comprehensive, with emphasis given to dancing, drawing, and horsemanship, as well as French, mathematics, and history. All in all, it was a perfectly respectable curriculum. Meanwhile, the king began to show Elizabeth the whole bureaucracy of the state and, gradually, the duties that she would one day have to assume. There is no reason to say that the queen's education was bad. She was just brought up differently. She was quick to digest information and always showed an incredible ability to concentrate. From an early age, she became adept at analyzing people and developed a good memory for names and faces. Another crucial moment of Elizabeth's youth happened in July 1939. At the age of 13, while visiting school with her parents, she bumped into Prince Philip of Greece, an outgoing 18-year-old cadet. Elizabeth was delighted and did not take her eyes off him for a second. She began to exchange correspondence with the prince, who served the Navy in the Mediterranean and the Far East during World War II. At first, no one looked kindly on the couple. Philip was relatively poor and came from a broken royal family, but he was no stranger to the British royal family. When the war ended, Philip gave serious thought to the possibility of asking Princess Elizabeth for her hand, for his character was formed. At 24, he was not much different from the person who reached his 99th birthday. According to the Queen, the war years were not a time of great hardship and danger for her. While the King and Queen were constantly going to and from Buckingham Palace, living in that building during the worst part of the Blitzkrieg, the princesses lived in Windsor Castle in state secrecy. This made sense. The royal family was the Germans' primary target. On September 13, 1940, George VI and Queen Elizabeth were nearly killed when a German bomb hit the palace. For the princesses, life was less exciting. Windsor Castle became the future home of Elizabeth II. However, during the war, it was a partially fortified house surrounded by sandbags, protected by troops and anti-aircraft guns. Apart from this protection, the princesses saw little of the war. Before the end of the armed conflict, Elizabeth joined the Auxiliary Territorial Service, taking classes in car and road mechanics, as well as driving lessons and military training. Her contribution to the war was more of a display than something practical. A beautiful young princess in military uniform handling a wrench was great propaganda. When Victory Day arrived, Elizabeth and Margaret received permission from their father to join the people gathered outside Buckingham Palace. The next day, she and her family visited London's worst affected areas. After the war, the social atmosphere their parents had known faded before Princess Elizabeth's eyes. At that point, the Windsors were a social figurehead with no streams of money and glamour to sustain them. On July 9, 1949, the royal family threw their first real party since the war in the garden of Buckingham Palace with 7,000 guests. Among them was Prince Philip, back from military service in the Far East a few months earlier. His name began to crop up in the news about weddings and parties to which Princess Elizabeth was invited. At the time, Prince Philip had already asked Princess Elizabeth to marry him, and she had told her father about it. The king, concerned that she was young, insisted on one condition: the couple would have to wait. The affairs of the empire took priority, and the royal family had to visit South Africa. This long, drawn-out visit would be part of the princess's training for the life she would later lead. And since the trip would last for months, there would be enough time for her to reflect on whether the decision to marry was the right one. After 18 months, Philip made a new request at Balmoral. She accepted immediately and began to convince her father. But this did not please everyone. The court's rationale for being against marrying Philip was connected with his German relatives, who fought on the side of the Nazis in World War II. After some time living with the would-be son-in-law, George VI acquiesced to the idea. Thus, the couple's engagement was made official, but privately. The announcement came on July 10, 1947. The public received the news with enthusiasm. The prince became a public figure. The wedding was to be a sober ceremony without any great frills, as England was in a severe budgetary crisis. However, many questioned the point of having a monarchy without a truly spectacular royal wedding. The king agreed to give up half of the savings he had accumulated during the war. Meanwhile, the couple would receive about 2/3 of what they wanted. Until that time, there was no tradition of having lavish royal weddings. But times were changing. After a war and in the middle of a monetary crisis, the population wanted pomp and circumstance. The event would be covered on the radio, and a documentary would be recorded to be screened in theaters. The princess was seen as a national symbol of youth, rebirth, and hope, and the wedding was the celebration of a new era. Prince Philip kicked off his merry days with a real sacrifice. To please his wife, he quit smoking, and he soon discovered how radically their lives would be transformed. The young couple moved into Clarence's house and undertook a major renovation of the palace. 3 months later, Queen Elizabeth became pregnant. Beginning in the late 1940s, Prince Philip's liaison with artists, actors, photographers, aristocrats, and some merrymakers of questionable reputation began to generate buzz. Several rumors of affairs with actresses and society women began to circulate. But after much meddling and questioning, no trace of Philip being unfaithful was ever found. The matter deeply irritated the Duke. Prince Charles was born on November 14, 1948, and given the name Charles Philip Arthur George, spanning most royal origins. The next 2 years were perhaps the happiest of the Queen's life. The princely couple spent a season in Malta, while Philip did military service on a destroyer. In August 1950, she gave birth to a second child, Anne. But warning signs quickly appeared. The king was ill. Soon after, he was diagnosed with cancer, probably a consequence of inveterate smoking for decades. The king underwent several surgeries. Elizabeth left Malta and went to live with her father, preparing herself for the worst. For many, the young couple were already eclipsing the monarch, just as Prince William and his wife are now eclipsing the now King Charles III. Since George was not well enough to take a trip to East Africa, the young couple went in his place and embarked on January 31st, 1952. Shortly thereafter, on February 6th, the king died in London, aged just 56. His daughter received the news through her husband on their vacation in Kenya. A typical representative of the Stoic generation, she gave no immediate sign of her concern. The first 3 months of her reign were the period of mourning for her father, lived in relative seclusion. In the summer, she moved from Clarence's house to Buckingham Palace. She went about the routines of a monarch and made her first state opening in Parliament on November 4th, 1952. Her coronation took place at Westminster Abbey on June 2nd, 1952. In the first decade of her reign, Elizabeth consummated her role as queen, developing a close bond with Winston Churchill, the first of 15 prime ministers she would work with during her reign, weathering a diplomatic disaster at the Suez Canal. Beginning in November 1953, the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh went on a 6-month World Commonwealth tour, including the first visit to Australia and New Zealand by a sitting British monarch. In 1957, after state visits to several European nations, she and the Duke visited Canada and the United States. In 1961, she made the first British royal trip to the Indian subcontinent in 50 years, and she was also the first sitting British monarch to visit South America in 1968 and the Persian Gulf countries in 1979. During her Silver Jubilee in 1977, she presided over a banquet in London with the leaders of the 36 Commonwealth members, traveled throughout Britain and Northern Ireland, and visited the South Pacific, Australia, Canada, and the Caribbean. With Queen Elizabeth's accession, Prince Charles became heir apparent. He was named Prince of Wales on July 26, 1958, and invested on July 1, 1969. The Queen's other children, besides Princess Anne, are Prince Andrew, born February 19, 1960, and Duke of York since 1986, and Prince Edward, born March 10, 1964, Earl of Wessex since 1999. They all have the surname Windsor, but in 1960, Elizabeth decided to establish the hyphenated name Mountbatten-Windsor for other descendants, not named Prince or Princess and Royal Highness. In response to press criticism, the Queen took steps to modernize her image and that of the monarchy, including broadcasting her annual Christmas message for the first time in 1957. Elizabeth's first decades on the English throne were marked by her decisions to preserve the cohesion of the Commonwealth, her attempts to keep the royal family above the people, and to modernize it. But the 1980s and 1990s had many controversies, betrayals, divorces, and scandals, tarnishing the image of the royal family and Queen Elizabeth as a whole. In 1981, all eyes were focused on the royal family when Prince Charles married Lady Diana Spencer at St. Paul's Cathedral, London. Although the couple quickly had 2 sons, William and Harry, their marriage imploded rapidly, causing substantial public embarrassment for the Queen and the entire royal family. This marriage was the worst crisis in the British monarchy since the abdication of Edward VIII, Queen Elizabeth's uncle. At first, the Queen found her daughter-in-law's moodiness and behavior odd, even though she and Prince Philip made every effort to welcome her into the family. In fact, Charles and Diana were deeply unhappy, consumed by the long suffering of an unsuccessful marriage. Both had affairs with other people. Rumors began to surface, but they kept quiet enough that the Queen and Duke did not realize what was happening. Many aristocrats thought that the two would get along in time, but they did not. In March 1992, the formal announcement of the separation came. The following month, it was reported that Prince Anne, the most reserved and diligent of the Queen's children, and her husband, Mark Phillips, would divorce. This was already bad enough, but the final straw was the publication in June 1992 of Andrew Morton's book, Diana, Her True Story. This changed everything. And by collaborating with a writer, and not simply photographers, Diana broke all the old royal family privacy codes. Among palace officials, 1992 is remembered as the worst moment in history of the modern monarchy. Even worse than the difficult days after Princess Diana's death in 1997. In addition, the Annus Horribilis of 1992 and Elizabeth's 40th year on the throne was marked by the separation of Charles and Diana, and Prince Andrew and his wife Sarah Ferguson, as well as the aforementioned Princess Anne and her husband, Mark Phillips. To make matters worse, there was a fire at Windsor Castle that year as well. In the face of public outcry over the use of state funds to restore royal residence, Queen Elizabeth agreed to pay taxes on her private income. This was not required by British law, although some previous monarchs had done so as well. At the time, her personal fortune was estimated at $11.7 billion. In another modernizing measure, she also agreed to open the state rooms of Buckingham Palace to the public for an admission fee at times when she was absent. It was an enormous success, with about 400,000 visitors in 1 year. New facilities and a better organized Queen's Gallery had to be established to show some of her art collections. The Prince of Wales decided to rebut Princess Diana's statements and authored a biography written by his friend and radio presenter Jonathan Dimbleby. In the book, he made revelations about his childhood, his harsh relationship with his father, and his affair with Camilla. The effect was devastating. When the Queen read the book's typescript proof, witnesses say she turned red in shock and stupor. The Prince of Wales caused even more damage by revealing pernicious details, saying that his parents had failed in his upbringing, in paragraphs bordering on cruelty. Once again, the monarchy's curtain had been drawn wide open, but this time by the future king. The separation of the Princess of Wales was difficult for the Queen. She had few illusions about her children. People say she believed that Diana was experiencing hell. She found Diana terribly difficult and was extremely sad when the children were taken away from her. The divorce battle dragged on, and every accusation was floating around in the tabloids. And this, of course, hit the Queen. In the controversial interview given to the BBC, Diana questioned the Queen's ability to relate to the people and suggested that Prince Charles was perhaps unfit for the post of the king. The interview was perceived as a direct provocation to the Queen. The Queen found the situation unbearable and decided that Charles and Diana ought to divorce. She talked with John Major and the Archbishop of Canterbury. At first, Diana refused, but quickly began to make demands. The Queen accepted some, but stripped the princess of the title Her Royal Highness. Despite devastating character clashes, the House of Windsor survived. And then came something even worse. When Charles and Diana divorced in 1996, the princess became incredibly popular with the British and international public. Her tragic death the following year triggered a tremendous wave of shock and sadness, as well as outrage at the royal family for what the public saw as mistreatment of the people's princess. Her death in 1997 in a Paris tunnel quickly fueled conspiracy theories. These conspiracies about Diana's death reflect two realities. First, millions of people much loved her, with a substantial portion of them siding with the princess in the media war against the Windsors. Second, her death put an end to an impending problem for the British monarchy. If Diana had not died, her star would have slowly faded, and she would have led a life like many other rich and glamorous women who were not members of the royal family. Diana's death was like a bomb. It was a horrific end to a brilliant and intense life. It was so sudden, the episode sparked anger and shock. The Queen quickly became the target of that anger, an unprecedented event in her reign. When Diana died, the Queen was at Balmoral with her husband and her grandchildren. As usual, they had taken the children to Sunday Mass. In the face of tragedy, the entire core of the royal family came together to help. A protective cocoon was created for the bereaved children. During her adult life, the Queen had had to tolerate criticism for not being a sufficiently engaged mother. The Queen decided to ignore media demands that she travel to London and participate in a vigil of sorts. Instead, she focused on her grandchildren. She enthusiastically embraced her role as grandmother. Meanwhile, in London, the people were demanding the Queen's return. Prime Minister Tony Blair was frightened by the people's turmoil and decided to talk to the Queen to get her to return to London. The Queen organized a flight to bring Diana's body and talked to the Spencers to prepare a state funeral. After a few days, the Queen returned to London. The monarch's speech on the eve of Diana's funeral was low-key. She tried to explain her feelings in an unprecedented way. She ended the speech with a call for unity under the crown. Diana's funeral was a chance to show the world the British nation united in grief and respect. The funeral was seen by 32 million people in Britain. After the funeral, the Queen perhaps became wiser, undoubtedly sadder, but also stronger. The popularity of the Queen and the entire royal family recovered during the first decade of the 21st century. Although 2002 marked Queen Elizabeth's Golden Jubilee, 50 years on the throne, the deaths of her mother, the beloved Queen Mother, and sister earlier that year clouded the celebrations. In 2005, the Queen enjoyed public support when she consented to the unthinkable marriage of Prince Charles to his longtime sweetheart Camilla Parker Bowles. In her 7th decade on the throne, Queen Elizabeth headed the grand spectacle of another royal wedding at Westminster Abbey, that of Prince William to Catherine Middleton in April 2011. The Duke and Duchess of Cambridge, who will become Britain's next monarchs, continued the line of succession with Prince George, born 2013, Princess Charlotte, born 2015, and Prince Louis, born 2018. Always at his wife's side and one of the busiest members of the royalty in Britain for much of his reign, Prince Philip ceased his royal duties in 2017 at the age of 96, ending the longest marriage in British monarchy history. Philip died in 2021 at 99. In May 2018, Prince Henry married American actress Meghan Markle, a biracial divorcee whose acceptance by the royal family indicated how modern it had become during Elizabeth's long reign. The couple had a son, Archie Mountbatten Windsor, in 2019, and a daughter, Lilibet Diana Mountbatten Windsor, in 2021. There were several rumors that Queen Elizabeth would abdicate the throne to pass it to Prince Charles. In 2017, she delegated some of her royal duties, such as the official Remembrance Day ceremony, to her son, fueling speculation that she was preparing to relinquish the throne to Charles. But on the contrary, she remained a consistent and stable presence at the end of Britain's reigning family until her peaceful death in September 2022 at her beloved country residence, Balmoral Castle. In June 2022, Britain celebrated Elizabeth's 70-year reign in the Platinum Jubilee, a 4-day national holiday that included the Trooping the Colour ceremony, a Thanksgiving service at St. Paul's Cathedral, a pop music concert at Buckingham Palace, and a festival featuring street arts, theater, music, circus, carnival, and costumes to honor the Queen's reign. Health problems limited Elizabeth's participation. The Queen's health concerns also led to a break in tradition when in September she appointed Liz Truss, Boris Johnson's replacement as Prime Minister, at Balmoral rather than at Buckingham Palace, where she had formerly appointed more than a dozen prime ministers. A few days later, on September the 8th, Elizabeth's death at the age of 96 shocked Britain and the world. Prince Charles succeeded her on the throne as Charles III. 10 days of national commemoration of her life and legacy, long planned as Operation London Bridge, followed. The Queen stood in public one day at St. Giles Cathedral in Edinburgh, and then 3 days at Westminster Hall in London, where mourners queued for several kilometers, waiting in some cases more than 24 hours to see Elizabeth's coffin. The somber funeral ceremony at Westminster Abbey on September the 19th was attended by 100 heads of foreign governments. After a procession to Wellington Arch, during which Big Ben struck, the Queen's coffin was taken by hearse to its final resting place in St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. Elizabeth was known for preferring the simple things in court life and for taking a serious and informed interest in governmental affairs, as well as fulfilling all traditional and ceremonial duties. She became a keen horsewoman. She had racehorses, participated in competitions frequently, and periodically visited the stud farms of Kentucky, United States. Her financial shares and estates made her one of the world's richest women.